So, good evening, everybody, and welcome to Foucault 1113. This is going to be the shortest introduction in the history of Foucault 1313. The hermeneutics of the subject is the title Foucault gave to the seminar he taught between January 6th and March 24th, 1982, for a total of 24 hours. The list provided by the English translator and dutifully compiled from the notes Frédéric Gros added to the French original includes a total of 61 Latin and Greek primary sources. An interesting project for the digital humanists in the room or live streaming this would be a digital historical atlas of Foucault's primary sources throughout the 13 seminars we are studying this year. Such map would give us not only the different ways in which he entered the archive, but also how the same primary sources are revisited in order to suggest new forms of questioning and new relations between those or among those primary sources. And as you know, they include everything from Hesiod to Homer and Althusser. True, those several hundred primary sources in Greek, Latin, French, English, German, or Spanish, among other languages, only cover the Western Hemisphere, maybe a bit more if we consider that some of his interventions also include Persian, Anatolian, Indian, and North African ancient and classical sources, but the Western Hemisphere nonetheless. Also, this is a heavily gender-biased corpus. All the items in this list were written by male writers. So it is within this expansive but also very narrow tradition that Foucault intends to figure out ways to talk about the hermeneutics of the subject, and in particular what he will call le souci de soi, the care of the self. As we saw last week, this project is at the intersection of two different lines of inquiry that coexist in Foucault's intellectual work since the very beginning of his tenure at the Collège de France, and that re-emerged as a joint effort during the early 80s. Maybe our responsibility now is to expand this inquiry. Maybe we need to follow some of the research leads, his famous pistes de recherche, not necessarily with the purpose of completing them, but rather with the purpose of making critique. Bernard began his introduction on the Foucault 1313 blog with some words of Angela Davis, pronounced only a few days ago at Columbia, and that I am going to repeat here, if you don't mind. We need movements that encourage care of self-care. We have to incorporate rituals and processes of self-care within the very processes of activism. Now, how do we incorporate such rituals? Indeed, how are they even rituals? What is the relationship between self-care and activism? And of course, this is in a very important sense central to Foucault's project, for whom activism was not only a matter of leading an active life, but also a matter of theoretical performance. Today, as I said, I don't want to take more time, for we have three incredible intellectuals who are going to deploy with us their ideas about and after this collection of labyrinthine lectures. I will simply go on and introduce them very shortly, since they are all too well known. Rosi Braidotti is distinguished university professor and founding director of the Center for the Humanities at Utrecht University. She was the founding professor of gender studies in the humanities at Utrecht between 1988 and 2005, and the first scientific director of the Netherlands Research School of Women's Studies. Among her latest work, I would like to mention La philosophie, là où on ne l'attend pas, Nomadic Theory, the portable Rosi Braidotti, the Posthuman, and forthcoming in 2016, edited together with Professor Paul Guillory, Conflicting Humanities. Lydia Liu is the Wutsun Tam Professor in the Humanities and Director of the Institute for Comparative Literature and Society. She is the author of The Freudian Robot, Digital Media and the Future of the Unconscious, or The Clash of Empires, the Invention of China in Modern World Marketing. Lydia is also a creative writer in Chinese and author of, in Chinese, The Nesbitt Code with Oxford University Press in Hong Kong, which received the 2014 Hong Kong Book Award. And finally, Rosalind Morris is a cultural critic, writer, filmmaker, and professor of anthropology at Columbia University. Rosalind's works includes accounts and drawings from Underground, the East Rand Proprietary Mine Sketchbook, 1906, and That Which Is Not Drawn with William Kentridge, among other titles. Her forthcoming publications include Was I Have Not Seen and Fetishism, Charles de Brosse and the History of an Idea, with David Leonard. She has served as a director of the Institute for Research on Women and Gender and associate director of the Institute for Comparative Literature and Society. Please join me in welcoming our guests. So, Rosie.
Thank you very much, Jesus, Bernard, and everybody. It's a great honor to be here, but sort of also a bit unexpected. I am only passing through Columbia as a guest at the Institute for Comparative Literature and Society, and I really did not expect to have to do this seminar. I'm very honored, but also a little bit puzzled. So I haven't had the chance to listen to all the sessions, and so if I repeat things that have already been said, just do your emails and do something else. And my apologies in advance. Second kind of introduction, embarrassing as it is, I am old enough to actually admit that I attended these lectures as a graduate student in Paris, which made the reading of them extremely painful in a manner that I actually was not prepared for. I can't really say more about this because over the space of time I think abandoned pretty much a lot of the premises of Foucault, or rather have taken the Deleuzian take on this, which we'll recognize in the reading that I give you tonight. So it's just reconnecting to something that has remained unresolved in so many ways. The relationship Foucault-Deleuze, my relationship to both, and of course my wild youth in Paris. So this all came back and it made the thinking about this paper difficult, but also inevitably going in the direction of virtuality and death, which is what a little bit I'd like to entertain you with. I've got 20 minutes, so I can't do much more. So we know what the main question is, page 462 for the lecture for Foucault. Instead of continuous, grand, general, and universal theories of the subject, let's do the analytics of the forms of reflexivity, the analytics of the practices on which such reflexivity is based, insomuch as that reflexivity constitutes the subject as such. Blam. 1981-82, I think Bourdieu was teaching a couple of rooms down the road, and crucifying the very possibility of the constitution of a subject, the necessity of an epistemology of the subject. So just the fact that subjectivity is put on the agenda, it seems banal today, but it's actually blasphemous if you put it back in the context. I will not do the context. I want to stay with the main line of reflection, because the question of what exactly is the process of constitution of a subject as a complex, not unitary entity, what Deleuze would call a singular multiplicity, which unfolds into a series of sub-queries. What exactly is this self, which we're supposed to be doing the hermeneutics of? How must one take care of oneself? What is the life bios that inhabits her? And I'm grateful to Jesus to talk about, to have mentioned the gender bias. This is not gender bias. This is androcentrism galore. Yeah. But okay, having said that, let's get on with it. We know that. So if you go into Foucault, that's what you get. There are many other thinkers that do other things. So let's supplement him with doses of other things and stay with this. But every time I speak about the subject, my small little gesture of resistance, I would make it into a her. Which is horrific in the Foucaultian context. So there is a double helix movement that traverses these questions: how to become the active subject of true discourse. There is an activation element throughout this text, and how to transform true discourse into an ethos, into an ethics of life. There is, as you know, and I think the others will talk about this, so I only mention the fact that this question of how to constitute the self through techniques and practices of existence continues, but also changes between classical Greece, the Hellenistic period, and Christianity. And you have the shift between the idea of taking care of the self as self-knowledge in the Platonic tradition, to the Stoics, in fact, taking care of the self as a practice, as a set of exercises. And the oscillation between self-knowledge and actual practices of the self, the epistemic and the more practical material, will structure a set of variations. In his splendid book on Foucault, there we go, Gilles Deleuze talk about the different rhythms of constitution of the subject, and reads the different moments of this in terms of foldings and unfoldings. And I think the idea of rhythmic variation of foldings around the question, how do you constitute the self? How does self-knowledge intersect with, interact with, improvises with cares of the self, is really a way in which we need to read what remains, let's say, an unfinished project, a project that lands in our loving hearts and minds and poses the responsibility of how do you read such a text. And I admire Alessandro and François Evaldo put all of this together, because when you read a text like this, and it reminds me of Deleuze's commentary on Spinoza, when it says that the ethics is a text within a text within a text. That you can read, you can read it sort of in a linear manner. You can read just the notes. You can read the appendixes. You can read. It's really totally 1,000 plateaus of textuality, which makes the reading extraordinarily actually apt for the digital era. We can make a website for each one of these, really. So Foucault is going to get to the punchline, which is the subject of Western thought is constituted when bios ceases to be the correlate of a techne, a reasonable rational art, to become instead the form of a test of the self. And I think that's the line that I want to pick up, the constitution of the self as testing the self through the practice of meditation, which is what the Stoics bring into Christianity in opposition to the know thyself of the Platonic tradition. Page 422, the practice of meditation, testing the self, rests on the Stoic suspicion towards oneself, which basically consisted in the decipherment of the self as a tissue of impulses of thought and of the heart which carry the mark of evil. 422. Calvin could have written this. It's not because I live in Holland and I'm traumatized by Spinoza, but the mark of evil imprinted in, it's terribly important. It's terribly important for the people who think that all of this kind of modulations or variations of a non-unitary subject are non-normative or deprived of any relationship to the hardship and the negativity of existence. Evil is written right into the script. The suspicion of the self is not about knowledge. It's about training through spiritual exercises of the self that assume that life is a continuous formative test, and that misfortune or good is actually good for you because it makes the test harder. It fosters the test attitude. We call it Stoicism. It's almost manual hard labor. The idea of life as a continuous formative and discriminated test raises the question of what exactly are we testing for? What is this a preparation for? Foucault. One does not take care of the self in order to live better or rationally, and one does not take care of the self in order to govern others, which is Alcibiades' problem. One must live so as to establish the best possible relationship to oneself. So key notions here: care of the self is not the same as self-knowledge. It is not about the soul's essential reality, passions that act on the body. It has no kingship to the divine, Plato. It has a meditation on our relation to the rest of the world. It's a relationship to the outside. How should we behave towards others? How to affect and be affected by things and others. There's a wonderful passage on animals and non-human for the posthumanists in the room. Phenomenal here. The privileged focus of Foucault is on the reflexive exercise of meditation, the exercise of thought on thought, assuming that it is our relationship to the rest of the world that is the matter that we need to put some order in. So what sort of praxis is this reflexive meditation? Takes two forms: the examination of the truth of what we think, the truth and the representation, and secondly, the practices that test oneself as the subject of truth, page 463. Am I really the ethical subject or the truth I know? The Stoics answered this double question through the practice of the premonition of evil, meditatio, premeditatio malorum, which unfolds into the meditation of death, which unfolds into the examination of conscience in the Christian era. How does it work? The premeditatio malorum, exercise of death, premonition of evils, is postulated on the horizon of not only a suspicion of the self, but a profound mistrust of the future orientation of life, and the imaginations and the imaginings about the future. The main theme of the premonition of evil is that we should not let ourselves be worried about the future. Being preoccupied by it means that we are occupied and we are passive, we are reactive. This is negative for the mind, to be absorbed by negative forces coming from the future. We are not free, and freedom is a major ethical value in pre-Christian times. So there are several reasons why being preoccupied by the future is unethical. It has to do with the primacy of memory. Thinking about the past has positive value in this system of thought, and there is an antinomy between memory and the future. And secondly, philosophically and ontologically, the future is nothing. It does not exist. It can exist, but if it pre-exists, it's predetermined, and if it is predetermined, it deprives us of freedom. It condenses to either impotence or to imagination. So says Foucault, 465, the whole art of oneself, the whole art of care of the self is constructed against these two things, the primacy of memory versus the future, and the nothingness of the future versus the necessity of an active present. So in order to get the premonition of evils going, you need to start from three fundamental premises that operationalize the mistrust of the future, and they are: cheer up, pour the first gin and tonic. Assume that all the worst evils will occur. Second, do not posit all these evils as probabilities, but as a certainty. It will happen to you. Thirdly, and it is going to happen to you quickly, soon, anytime, without further delay. The accident is just waiting to happen. It is only a question of time. What emerges from this is not successive time, but immediate time. All possible evils are always already present, ready to befall us. This mistrust is the nullification of the future that makes everything possible present in a sort of test of endurance, a test of thought. So says Foucault, 471, we do not start from the present in order to simulate the future. We give ourselves the entire future in order to simulate the present. Very lovely, nice reversal. In other words, I speak my language, the thinkability of the present rests upon a temporal frame whereby it is the instance of death as a constant presence and as a continuous present that makes it possible for the subject to survey her own life as an event and as a becoming. This approach also operates a reduction of reality, adds Foucault, by making the only thing imaginable in reality all the evils that can befall you at any point in time. More gin and tonic. So the objective of the meditation on death, on evils, is to seal off the future through the simulation of actuality, page 473. And by this means, we can equip ourselves with a truth which, when the event does occur, will be of use for us to reduce the element of strict truth that could move us or disturb our soul if we were not thus prepared. It's like an immunity shot. You are prepared because you've been training. And it's really a sort of autoimmunity here. It is a sort of preparation realized through the test of the non-reality of what we actualize in this exercise of thought. 473. So preliminary conclusion number one. To practice philosophy is to make preparation. Were you in the Girl Guides? Be prepared, remember? I was a patrol leader, you will not be surprised to know. To make preparation, to put oneself in the frame of mind that one has to regard all of life as a test. This is the context out of which, argues Foucault, the Greeks extract the art of the self as an art of living. It's an art of getting ready, preparing. Foucault, caring about the self means equipping ourselves for a series of unforeseen events by practicing a number of exercises which actualize these events with an unavoidable necessity, and in which we strip them of the imaginary reality they may have in order to reduce their existence to the strict minimum. It is these exercises, in the interplay of these exercises, that we will be able to live existence as a test throughout our life. How many gin and tonics do we have? 6, I think. The specific role of death is the second preliminary conclusion. The meditation of death is a continuation of the premonition of evils, insofar as death is not just a possible but a necessary event. It is not just relative but absolute gravity, and it may occur at any event. You will die. The meditation on death, 477, 478, brings all the other premonition to the highest point of awareness. What is specific about death, however, is that it raises the possibility of a certain form of self-awareness, a certain gaze, says Foucault, that makes us focus on the point of view of death. This actualization of death in life makes it possible for us to live the present as if it were living one day, as if it was our last day. My favorite thinker outside Deleuze, Marcus Aurelius, on live each day as if it were the last. So the meditation on death allows the individual to see herself in an instantaneous view as summarizing the full duration of one's life in a stream of consciousness, and from that moment on, frozen in this interruption by death, says Foucault, the present, the moment or the day will appear in their reality, in the reality of their value. The value of what I'm doing, of what I am thinking, my activity, will be revealed if I am thinking that this is the last moment, the last day. In fact, selecting the finest moment of one's life on the edge of death becomes the criterion by which you should then prepare your death. You should place yourself in the best situation for dying at every moment as an affirmative ethical position. So preliminary conclusion number 2, it is the thought of death that triggers an evaluative memorialization of one's life, which enables one to grasp the value of the present. 480, judgment on the present and evaluation of the past are carried out in this thought of death, which precisely must not be a thought of the future, but rather a thought of myself in the process of dying here and now. In my reading, and I'm taking a step out of the text, this is Foucault on self-styling one's death. And the idea of styling your own death as life and life as dying in the autopoietic sense is central to Foucault's work, and I think to all of Foucault's students. The practices of the self are an ethical and practical exercise index on this specific temporality. In constructing one's subjectivity within this framework, you abandon not only essentialistic vision of human nature, but also the idea that the subject is necessarily linked to the legal scaffoldings of liberal individualism. Again, in the Foucault book, Deleuze says that when Foucault talks about the processes of subjectivation, is looking at forces that lie beneath the potestas, the legal social scaffolding. And Deleuze will go further by saying that we're talking about forces that are before, beneath, and beyond the actual constitution, legally, socially, potestas driven of the subject. So the self, thus constructed through concrete and material practices of accountability for her position, sits in a tradition of philosophical self-reflexivity, which tend to go towards practices of narration and writing. There are several references to narrativity, narration, rhetoric, novels in these lectures, and Greek novels, which was a new thought, I'd forgotten that one. And this line of ethical reasoning involves two elements: a very material grounding, exercises of the self, what a body can do, limits and thresholds of what bodies can endure, and secondly, the positions of the subject, of the ethical relation, in making the subject actively involved in processes of evaluation of the type of relations that you have. In all of this, I think that Foucault bears a very huge debt to Maurice Blanchot, a thinker that I love dearly, on the issue specifically of the void created by the nullification of the future. Endorsing Blanchot against Freud, Foucault, and Deleuze will follow, inscribes death into life not in the dyad eros thanatos, but rather as the necessary temporal frame that creates the present by nullifying the future or collapsing it into the here and now. What matters is not death as the big gaping hole awaiting at the edge of time, but rather the modes in which we live, perceive, and negotiate with dying in the course of life, but cultivating positive ethical passions and encounters. This is more Deleuze than Foucault. Deleuze would say by actualizing certain arts and modes of existence. That death is not entropy or return to inert, lifeless matter, but rather the opening up of new intensity and possibilities, also of the inhuman and non-human kind. I refer again to the pages of these lectures on animals and non-human. Self-styling one's death means cultivating an ethical approach, a style of conceptual creativity, which is sustained by exercises, practices, and training. It's hard work. They allow the subject to express and experience this constitutive longing for something that is not life, outside of life, the awareness of an attachment to the void, which lies at the heart of subjectivity. Nullification of the future, void of an outside that eludes and yet frames the subject. To actively desire one's death is the same as wanting to live life as intensively, that's Deleuze, and as self-reflexively, that's Foucault, as possible. My life is my story about dying in my fashion, expressing my ethical desire to know how to live and care for the self, how to die as the certainty of my absence, of my not having to be there. We mortals are ultimately attracted to what we are trying to avoid. We are idiosyncratic suicides, not from despair, but because it is literally our nature to die. I'm quoting Adam Phillips in a wonderful book on death in psychoanalysis. Foucault on Blanchot, 1966, La pensée du dehors. Fantastic text, where Foucault talks about Blanchot as the thinker that allows thought to stand outside subjectivity, setting its limits as though from without, articulating its end, making its dispersion shine forth, taking it in only its invincible absence. The void serves as the site, the distance in which it is possible to take a glimpse of what philosophy would call interiority, but that for Blanchot is the thought from the outside and the thought of the outside. Although this experience sort of involves going beyond oneself, beyond being and discourse, it is pointing towards the silence, beyond all language, the nothingness beyond all being. I think that Blanchot's thought rests on the double structure of death as both personal and impersonal. In the instance of my death, Blanchot addresses the paradox of the impersonality of life, death as the implacable presence immanent to every human life, not as a teleological destination, but as the event that has always already occurred. At the level of awareness, at the level of consciousness, death is the event that has already taken place. As an individual occurrence, it will take the form of the physical extinction of the body, but in the sense of awareness of finitude, of the interrupted flow of my being there, death has already happened. It has already taken place. We are synchronized with death. Death is the same thing as the time of our living, and so far as we are mortal, that is to say, living on borrowed time. It is the time of that as event that makes it possible to think of the time span of my death as the totality of my time. This means that what we fear the most is what we are attracted to the most, as I said before, and that as death alone can free us into life. Each of us is seduced into go on living, just a life, just a project, and crafting it, self-styling as we go. So in this respect, the death that pertains to a past that is forever present is not individual, but impersonal. It creates a subjectivity that is much more than the self, exterior to the self. It is a precondition for our existence, for the present as continuous practice of self-styling, Deleuze would call it becoming, but it is also a kind of an ethical imperative to be prepared and get ready for it. It's hard work. The proximity to death is a close and intimate friendship that calls for an ethics based on dexterity, dedication, endurance in the double sense of temporal duration or continuity, and spiritual suffering or sustainability. Wisdom is the contemplation of the eternity of the life forces, not the perennity of death. Making friends with the impersonal necessity of death is an ethical way of installing oneself in life as a reflexing meditation on a subject yet to come, never fully to be, always in becoming, in relation to multiple others.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much. Lydia.
Well, that was fantastic intervention. Listening to you, I thought I read a different book. Well, certainly this book is usually regarded as Foucault's reflections on ethics, and I wanted to call your attention to a quote that I put in my posting, online posting. Foucault says, "I think we may have to suspect." This is on page 252. I think we may have to suspect that we find it impossible today to constitute an ethic of the self, even though it may be an urgent, fundamental, and politically indispensable task. It is true, after all, that there is no first or final point of resistance to political power other than in the relationship one has to oneself. End of quote. An enigmatic remark for a book that is preoccupied with something like ethical thinking. All right. I just begin by saying this is an extremely long book. The task of understanding is difficult, and I think it's even more difficult to do something that Daniele Lorenzini suggested last October when he posted some remarks. And I thought one of the remarks he made best captures what I think, well, what Foucault means to me, and maybe to some of you. He says, quote, "Foucault incites us to think otherwise," end of quote. In the course of reading these lectures at the Collège de France, it struck me that the exercise in thinking otherwise, which is easier said than done, was probably the main reason that I wanted to return to his work time again. The hermeneutics of the subject is an excessively long, rambling series of lectures. It provides us with a good opportunity to examine how Foucault himself approached the task of thinking otherwise. In my mind, I always picture him as like doing the work of philosophy in dusty archives and libraries, rather than having a company with philosophers. I remember asking Paul Ravenel about Foucault's time at UC Berkeley, and one of the things Paul said to me that stuck in my memory was that Foucault spent most of his days plowing through the rare books and manuscript collections of Bancroft Library. Before joining Columbia, I also spent many years teaching at Berkeley, where Paul, Leo Bassani, and other colleagues used to host Foucault's visits. But unlike Rosie, I didn't arrive on the scene until 1990, when it's either too late or too early to witness the intellectual excitement that Foucault's lectures had occasioned on that campus. Now it occurs to me, thinking otherwise needs to be conditioned by some kind of a temporal, spatial, and conceptual dislocation and reorientation in regard to one's object of study. Whatever it is, Foucault's method promises to take us to places elsewhere. I italicize elsewhere, you can't see it. So we would no longer feel fully at home with our own discipline, field, or habit of reasoning. Perhaps this is related to what Stathis Gouguras had in mind last week when he spoke with brilliant insight about Foucault's inquiry, promising, quote, an opening to doing, telling, and seeking, end of quote. Back in Berkeley, Foucault was invited to give the Howison Lectures in Philosophy in October 1980, where he discussed the genealogy of the modern subject in 2 lectures. The first one was Subjectivity and Truth, and the second one was Christianity and Confession. Luckily, his audio recording is available online, so I'll just refer you to his own voice, and I've given a link in my post so you may go and hear his lecture. Moderated by someone who didn't identify himself. Could be Leo Bassani, I don't know. Maybe someone can identify. Foucault also gave a version of these lectures at Dartmouth College, and these discussions would then develop into the year-long seminar at the Collège de France that we're reading today. A transcription and translation of these lectures with very helpful footnotes has just been released by the University of Chicago Press in a single volume this year called About the Beginning of the Hermeneutics of the Self, edited by Foucault and Lorenzini. It just came out in 2016, very timely. Foucault declares in his first lecture that he tries, quote, to get out from the philosophy of the subject through a genealogy of the subject, by studying the constitution of the subject across history which had led us to the modern concept of the self, end of quote. This project appears straightforward at first glance, but why did he want to get out from the philosophy of the subject that had prevailed in continental Europe before and after World War II? It turns out that he had 2 issues with it. First, the philosophy of subject, referring chiefly to the philosophy of consciousness, failed to ground a philosophy of knowledge, and especially scientific knowledge. Secondly, this philosophy of meaning failed to take into account the formative mechanisms of signification and the structure of systems of meaning. Foucault identifies 2 paths that try to lead us out of this philosophy of consciousness. The first path was logical positivism, represented by the theory of objective knowledge, and the second is semiology, an analysis of systems of meaning, represented by certain schools of linguistics, psychoanalysis, and anthropology that are commonly grouped under structuralism. So these are the 2 paths. Foucault says he's not going to follow either of these paths. And with his genealogy of the subject, he proposes a third path, which he describes, quote, a critical philosophy that seeks the conditions and the indefinite possibilities of transforming the subject, of transforming ourselves, end of quote. Having studied the techniques of domination, he is now prepared to devote himself to the study of techniques of the self in the projected multi-volume study of the history of sexuality, as you already know. But this outline should help us situate Foucault's initial focus on the care of the self in the years 1980 through 82. The fragments and comments I posted online, and I will explain below, do not pretend to do justice to the richness and thoroughness of Foucault's analytical endeavor in these lectures. At least we're lucky enough to have Bernard Harcourt's lucid introduction that summarizes Foucault's main arguments and clarifies the central thread of his thinking, leading from the lectures from the year before, Subjectivity and Truth, and Wrongdoing and Truth-Telling. What I'm going to do tonight is set out some issues surrounding Foucault's concept of the subject in his 82 lectures and raise a few questions for discussion. My intervention consists of two broad rubrics in the form of questions. First, what is the subject in its irreducibility? This is Foucault's own language. The subject in its irreducibility. Secondly, where is the Western subject in Foucault's archive? So I now come to the first question. Taken as a whole, the genealogy of the subject involves an analysis of the forms of reflexivity, as Rosie already pointed out, in so much as these forms of reflexivity constitute the subject as such. This is page 462 of this volume. Foucault proposes an alternative history of the practices on which these forms of reflexivity are based, as opposed to the philosophical tradition of the West that projects a history of continuous development of the knowledge of the self, extending from Plato to Husserl through Descartes, or from Plato to Freud via Augustine. Freud's own genealogical method takes the problem of the subject elsewhere, italicized, proposing a very different trajectory, as you have seen in the readings. For example, in his reading of Plato's Alcibiades, the care of the self presupposes a certain relationship between the self and other through discourse. Foucault's analysis goes, I quote, "What does it mean when we say Socrates speaks to Alcibiades?" The answer given is, we mean that Socrates makes use of language. This is very simple. This very simple example is at the same time very revealing. The question posed is the question of the subject. End of quote. Foucault goes on to raise another question. Quote, what subject do we presuppose when we evoke this activity of speech, which is the speech activity of Socrates towards Alcibiades? End of quote. Foucault answers the question by drawing a distinction between the subject of action from the set of elements being words, sounds, and so on, that constitute the action itself, that enable it to be carried out. And he concludes the analysis with an enigmatic remark. He says, such action reveals, quote, the subject in its irreducibility, end of quote. What is the subject in its irreducibility but a subject in discourse? The action of speech to which Foucault refers is not limited to speech acts, as many scholars seem to believe. Along the tradition of John Austin, John Searle, and other Anglo-American theories of elocution, perlocution, performativity, and so on, which frequently let the philosophy of consciousness slip through the back door, if not the front door, and strictly speaking, an act of enunciation, which Foucault would call enunciative modality, is not a speech act so much as it posits. What it does is posits a subject position in discourse without recourse to the philosophy of consciousness. This is extremely important. I want to emphasize. This distinction is often overlooked. It's overlooked largely because people often confuse Foucault's categories of discourse analysis with Anglo-American speech act theory. I don't think we can really appreciate Foucault's methodological innovation in this undertaking or in his other genealogical projects if we continue to perpetuate that misunderstanding. If Foucault takes great pains to distinguish his own method from that of the British analyst, quotes his own words, in the archaeology of knowledge, and he prefers not to use terms like locution, elocution, perlocution, etc. in his analysis of discourse, there is no reason why we should read speech act theory into his highly original and fully developed theory of discourse. It's like reading Newton back to Einstein, all right? Certainly we can talk about gravity, but not in those terms, all right? For Foucault, the act of enunciation is more than a speech act because it posits a subject position in discourse, regardless of the speaker's intentions. Take his analysis, Parisia, March 10th. Foucault says, this is on page 391. Foucault says, quote, "In Christian spirituality, it is the guided subject who must be present within the true discourse as the object of its own true discourse. In the discourse of the one who is guided, the subject of enunciation must be the referent of the utterance. This is the definition of confession, l'aveu." All right, end of quote. Notice he's not talking about language here. He's talking about discourse. Now, reflexivity in this case, precisely is achieved through a discursive structure that compels the structure, the subject of enunciation to be its own referent. That is, referent of the utterance. Sometimes in English they translate it as statement, whatever. The French original is énoncé. But how is this accomplished, this discursive reflexivity accomplished? Last week, was it last week or 2 weeks ago? Last week. When Judith Butler spoke of the self-constitution of the subject and its submission to power through the technique of l'aveu, she brought up the idea of the mode of address, reading l'aveu as a scene of address that enables the binding of the subject to discourse. This reading, if you remember, was followed by a lively discussion of binding and unbinding, especially after Guguru's presentation. And here I would like to raise a different set of questions concerning the whereabouts of the subject in any discourse, binding or non-binding. The question is, how does the subject get into any discourse in the first place? Is it by speaking? Is it by complying with an authoritative command? Is it by seduction? Is it by coercion or whatnot? Of course, we're not talking about grammatical subjects. We're talking about a discursive subject here. Foucault himself discusses a multiplicity of conditions for the operation of the enunciative action, a function of which speaking merely fulfills one condition for the production of the subject in discourse. The other conditions include the domain of objects, enunciative networks, the spatial temporal coordinates that structure all discourses in some enunciative modality which Émile Benveniste would term deixis. Foucault makes it clear, quote, "The enunciation is an unrepeatable event." Now, he's contrasting this with a statement, a sentence you can repeat. But enunciation, no. Quote, "It is a situated and dated uniqueness that is irreducible." See, irreducible. Subject in its irreducibility has something to do with temporal spatial coordinates, which are fundamentally linked with politics. Oh, he didn't say that. I said that. Quote, this is how he puts it. "Yet this uniqueness allows of a number of constants, grammatical, semantic, logical, by which one can, by neutralizing the moment of enunciation and the coordinates that individualize it, recognize the general form of a sentence, a meaning, and proposition." End of quote. This is Archaeology of Knowledge, page 101. It seems that Foucault's subject, in its irreducibility, has something to do with the notion of enunciation as a discursive event. This puts him in direct dialogue with Benveniste, who was the first to propose and analyze the subject of enunciation in his book, 2-volume book, Problems in General Linguistics. Now, it's important to reconsider what Foucault is doing with discourse, which should not be confused with speech or language, or we risk simplifying his analysis and being led to think, in the case of the truth therapy invented by Dr. Loret, that the patient must say, yes, I'm mad, under the coercion of cold shower torture, to assume the subject position in the 19th century discourse of mental illness. Okay. Ibai has I asked Ibai to play this clip, less than 2 minutes, which is from Foucault's Berkeley lecture, the beginning of that lecture, describing the scene of torture. Very short. He's in his own voice.
Yeah.
In a work consecrated to the moral treatment of madness and published in 1840, a French psychiatrist, Loret, tells of the manner in which he has treated one of his patients. Treated and, as you can guess, cured. One morning, he takes his patient, let's call him Mr. S. He takes Mr. S, his patient, into a shower room. He makes him recount in detail his delirium. Well, all that, says the doctor, is nothing but madness. Promise me not to believe in it anymore. The patient hesitates, then promises. That's not enough, replies the doctor. You've already made me similar promises, and you haven't kept them. And he turns on a cold shower above the patient's head. Well, yes, I am mad, the patient cries. The shower is turned off. The interrogation is resumed. Yes, I recognize that I am mad, the patient repeats. But, he adds, because you are forcing me to do so. Of course, another shower. Well, says the patient, I assure you, however, that I've heard voices and seen enemies around me. Another shower. Well, then, says Mr. S, I admit it. All that is madness. I am mad.
Okay. Well, I thought our panel would not be complete without inviting Foucault's voice. So the one question that didn't come up when we had a little discussion of this parable was that would saying no disqualify the patient as a subject in this discourse? This question did not arise in Foucault's discussion. And if we take his discourse analysis seriously, the negative reply, which is merely a logical proposition, would not have released the patient from his assujettissement to that discourse, even though it would have invited more cold showers. I don't have the time to really to go into Benveniste. I think Benveniste, I think it's very strange that there have been some curious silences surrounding his name. And without understanding Foucault's interlocutor, Benveniste, I don't think we know what he's doing with discourse and enunciation. So I'm just calling for re-evaluation of Benveniste. Now, quickly, I move to my next part. Next big question, which is, where is the Western subject in the archive? I think Foucault is strangely preoccupied with the Western subject. And let me give you a quote. On page 230, where Foucault gets into one of those summaries, and he's often summarizing what he's doing here. it's not the first time. He does it a number of times. And after the first hour's exegesis of Marcus Aurelius, he says, quote, I would now like to pose this question of relationship between truth-telling and the government of the subject in ancient thought before Christianity. I would also like to pose it in the form and within the framework of the constitution of a relationship of self to self, in order to show how within this relationship of self to self, the formation of a certain type of experience of the self became possible, which is, it seems to me, typical Western experience of the subject's experience of himself in the West, but also of the experience the Western subject may have or create of others. End of quote. Now, is Foucault making a comparative point here, or is he redrawing the boundaries between the West and the rest? What are the intellectual stakes in his appeal to experience? Can there be an enunciative modality of comparison without making an explicit act of comparison? To put it bluntly, it would be preposterous to suggest, for example, the idea of an Eastern or Oriental subject for all sorts of good and bad reasons. Either the East is a mental mirage and does not really exist, in which case the West would be the flip side of that mirage, as Edward Said would put it. Or there is no subjecthood in the East, regardless of the proliferation of Confucian, Taoist, and other exercises in self-cultivation, or what might look like ascesis from a distance. The good reason I imagine Foucault himself giving would be that the Western subject has a unique history or genealogy that can be excavated through the textual traces left in the archives, whereas other people may have had a similar tradition. But how do we know they're not just superficially similar, but that tradition would not have added up to anything like a genealogy of the subject that is uniquely marked by the relationship of veridiction and subjectivation. In that case, then Foucault's lectures ought to have been titled The Hermeneutics of the Western Subject. But I don't think he should. I wanted to push this point a bit further. Can there be such a thing called the Western subject? If so, what is its ground of unity? How does the problem even arise? I'm not criticizing Foucault for his omission of the rest of the world, since his critical philosophy never even aspires to being inclusive of all and everybody on universal grounds. Rather, the question I wanted to pose here is, where is the Western subject in Foucault's archive? Unlike Benvenists who work with Sanskrit, Persian, Greek, and other ancient languages who aim toward a universal theory of language and discourse, Foucault rejects the universal history of the subject and chooses to focus on the technique of the subject peculiar to the West. As you may recall from his genealogical narrative, the main arc of the development of this Western subject starts roughly from the Hellenistic and Roman periods, where the technique of the self first emerged and underwent its initial transformation in early Christianity and then on to medieval Christianity, before moving on to the next phases of transformation in the Renaissance, the Reformation, the Counter-Reformation. This is the narrative. His primary sources, as Jesus just mentioned, were in Greek and Latin, right? All right. One crucial piece of evidence that he draws on in his lectures, as well as in his 1981 lectures, to illustrate the first phase of transformation from the pagan technique of the self to Christian spirituality in monastic institutions, comes from the writings of early Christian fathers, especially John Cassian's institutes and conferences. As we know, Cassian had traveled to Syria, Palestine, and Egypt in the 4th century in search of spiritual practices of the East, and recorded what he learned in the Egyptian desert. If he transmitted the teachings of the desert fathers of Egypt and went back to build a Western monastic institution in Egyptian style, what is so typically Western about the technique of the subject that supposedly constitutes the first most significant phase of transformation from Hellenistic and Roman ascetics to early Christian spirituality in Foucault's genealogy of the subject. The problem here is that Foucault was not unaware of Cassian's spiritual journey to Egypt, and he still decided to treat these texts simply as sources of the Western subject. Bernard communicated with me about his earlier discussions of Cassian, Foucault's discussion of Cassian in the government of the living, and then, if you recall from last week in the wrongdoing and truth-telling lectures, Foucault devotes even more pages to the discussion of John Cassian, re-examining the figures of the money changer, the miller, and the centurion, as you probably remember. Okay, so where do these figures come from? They come from Cassian's text. And then Foucault even mentions Cassian's book, The Conferences, where the author, I quote Foucault, recounted a certain number of important conversations with the most famous and most pious monks of the communities of Syria, Egypt. Cassian, at heart, is the one who introduced the practice and theory of monastic life into the West, and he was the principal agent in the transfer and in the translation of Oriental into Western monasticism. End of quote. Okay, knowing full well that the monastic technique of the self was brought back from Egypt, why does Foucault insist on the uniqueness of the Western subject? Is it because he regards the East or the Christian East as part of the story of the rise of the Western subject, and then that subject forgetting its past in its subsequent dash toward modernity? If that's the reasoning behind it, then his critical genealogy of the subject may, in spite of itself, be subsumed under the Hegelian spirit of world history as the spirit moves from east to west, culminating in modern Europe. Clearly, there are limits to how far Foucault can push his critique, for such auto-critique always runs the risk of redefining the object of that critique, that is the West. But are there other ways of engaging with ancient texts and archives of the past? Yes, I think so. Let me just give just one little bit. I have more, but I'm running out of time. Foucault's lectures aroused my curiosity about this monk, John Cassian. So I began to read him. Like Foucault, I was fascinated by his writing. Of course, this monk could not have possibly foreseen the arrival of the Western subject, or even Michel Foucault, since he lived in the 4th and 5th centuries, and that's more than 16 centuries ago. His encounter with the Egyptian father, Abbot Moses, known as Saint Moses the Black, someone who came from Ethiopia, is written in the form of transcribed speech. And this writing is presented as a passive conduit or medium for the other's voice. In this book, Cassian plays the classic role of what Foucault would call a good listener. And through his conduit, we're supposed to hear Abbot Moses' own teaching. Again, Abbot Moses' words come down to us through Cassian's medium of writing that would serve as one of the archives, would become one of the archives for Foucault's lectures. But the medium itself must be scrutinized if it is to be mobilized as an archive. And I don't have time to go into specific examples. And I think if you read carefully, Cassian was not the one who wrote about the money changer, the miller, and the centurion. It was Abbot Moses who did. Okay, who spoke about that. That relationship, writing and orality, and whose voice did Foucault hear there, right? So it's already a hybrid there. So I don't see the Western subject in this archive. Thank you.
Thank you,
Okay. Stanley Fish is in the room. We have many versions of this course. I will not try to produce artificial continuities between our various readings, but I will start with a confession, which is that I'm neither an expert on Foucault nor in any deep sense a Foucauldian. But of course, like a lot of people, my first encounters with Foucault was through Les mots et les choses, Maison de la Clinique, the books. And I loved them. They were masterpieces. They were stylistically gorgeous. They were seductions for every reader. That makes reading this course a source of perplexity. Let us say that this course resists the person who thinks of Foucault as the writer of that kind of prose. And insofar as the style resists one, it poses the question of style, and I want to talk a little bit about that. But I want to try and describe to you what I think was necessary for me to understand what I believe to be the project of this text, and to give you 3 theses as a result of that effort to think through. There is, of course, it's entirely unclear to me how what is the relationship between the descriptive project of this text and the normative project, or between what Foucault himself calls history and philosophy. Frédéric Gros makes a very strong claim that you cannot hear me?
Yeah, we cannot hear you.
Okay, well, I will try to be louder. Frédéric Gros makes a strong claim that, Foucault wasn't in love with Hellenism. This wasn't simply an avowal of the practices of care of the self that are nonetheless quite lovingly described. And I think this is perhaps a dubitable claim that he makes, but it's still, I think, up for grabs as to the relationship between the descriptive and the normative part of the text. And for every effort to de-transcendentalize the subject, which is to be accomplished through historicization on Foucault's part, there is a kind of resurgent re-transcendentalization of the subject that occurs, not least because the question of sexual difference is not posed. Nonetheless, there is an effort in this text, I think, to understand precisely why a discourse, a set of practices, a set of regulative ideals, whatever, that claims to be universal, nonetheless becomes precisely the location of exclusion. That is, all those things that are supposed to be available to every subject when practiced in fraternity, sects, and other kinds of limiting social groups become the opposite. And what we have here, of course, is the description of an aspiration toward a universal practice of care of the self, which is nonetheless care of the self for those who govern others. That is fundamentally the political topos within which I think this project takes place. So Rosie and I are on opposite ends of the table, an I and an A, and we will take perhaps a different position on this. So one of the ways of thinking about how Foucault comes to that for me is to think about the context within which the lectures are written. Why is this such a different text? This is the first step. It is not the only step, and I want to avoid a kind of vulgar contextualism. But 1981, of course, Reagan's inauguration sees his proper name become, the twin to Thatcher's in the era that we will call neoliberal. We've talked about that a lot in this seminar, and I'm not particularly interested in the question of whether Foucault is a neoliberal or not. However, it is the case that event and its association with the release of the Iranian hostages sets up a kind of strained and over-determining a set of conditions within which Foucault develops this. 1981, of course, is also the year in which HIV/AIDS gets its name, and this tempts us to want to read anachronistically and to attribute to these meditations on death and so forth a kind of, an uncanny melancholia. I think that would be wrong. On the other hand, given Foucault's aspiration to produce a practice of self that is integrated with an intellectual project, this is not to be taken off the table entirely. So, as I said, we've talked at length about Foucault's possible complicity with neoliberalism. whatever position we take on that, this year of this course, the year of Reagan's ascension, what Etienne Balibar earlier described as Foucault's double disappointment with both the communist parties and party states of Europe and the Iranian Revolution, was complete, I think. And the disappointment is not just background. This is not just context in the sense of contextualism. On February 10th, in the first hour of his lecture, Foucault describes his intention to analyze the phenomenon. Are you still hearing me? To analyze the phenomenon of conversion. To analyze the phenomenon of conversion as it was initially posed by the Hellenistic and early Roman philosophers, first as conversion of the self, the swa, then conversion to the self, aswa, and then conversion to oneself, aswa-même. And he's going to do a lot of work by virtue of an analysis of language and not just discourse. And indeed, I've written a very ridiculously long blog trying to think about this course in relationship to Lacan's essay, The Field and Function of Speech and Language in Psychoanalysis, where Lacan lays out, in fact, many of the same problematics and provides for us a method for reading Foucault reading Foucault with Lacan in a manner that attends to the rhetorical strategies, the tropologies, and so forth of the text. So, for example, there's an enormous play in this course on the relationship between maîtrise, mastership, and maîtrise in the sense of the matrix within which subjects are formed. No care of the self except through the master, says Foucault. But this claim is being operated in the textual practice of the lectures, which are written in ways that no previous lectures have been written. And Frédéric makes a good case of that. But Foucault describes conversion as, quote, one of the most important technologies of the self the West has known. This is on page 208. And proceeds to mention, but only in passing in this instance, its place in Christianity. And then he interrupts himself to remark that in the 19th century, the idea of conversion returned and was, quote, introduced into the thought, practice, experience, and political life in a spectacular and, we can say, dramatic way. One day, the history of revolutionary subjectivity should be written, end quote. This is 208. He will not write that history. To the contrary, he can only note with something like a sigh, quote, the bland experience of our immediate contemporaries, quote, who only convert to renunciation of revolution. The great converts today are those who no longer believe in the revolution. The footnote there is to Plato, but the reader will hear the echo of Heidegger, of course, for all sorts of reasons. And this is because only the week previously, on February 3rd, the usual format of the lectures has been ruptured with a question or series of questions, quite unprecedented in this series. He is asked by an auditor in the course quite aggressively whether there are not some fundamentally Lacanian concepts coming up as operators in what he has said, and there's a kind of wonderful exchange, and he says, I am not the person to judge what is Lacanian in my discourse, but only Lacan and Heidegger introduced the question of the relation of the subject and truth into philosophy. I will be on the side of Heidegger. It's sometimes hard to believe that. Despite the fact that there is in this restitution of Marcus Aurelius the return to the question of being toward death. I think it's more a Marcus Aurelian understanding than a Heideggerian. So, as Foucault said in his own Les mots et les choses about Marx, it is possible to read the course in the way Foucault advocated reading Capital as a book about a word, a single word. And the word, he says, is value. I would say that at least the first half of the course is about a single word, conversion. And not confession, as it was in the previous course, but conversion. And this is a strange thing. Right? What is conversion doing here? It is obviously not the conversion that is enunciated by Paul in Acts 2. Come to me, repent, you will be baptized, you will receive the word of God. Everything in this text is insists on the contrast between the forms of mastership and the nature of confession as well as conversion between the pagan and the Christian era in terms of whether one is oriented by God, the Word, revelation, and text, or by others, the relationship to others, the relationship to the Master as a way of relating to oneself. So, this is a course about conversion. And this will probably sound ridiculous, but anyways, I'm going to go with it for a while just to see how far we get with it. The question then for me to answer is, what does conversion respond to? Conversion is the mode of transformation of the subject achieved through techniques of care for the self, of the self. What does it respond to? What phenomenon does it objectify? What object does it seek to disavow, or to contain, or to constitute as the terrain of its intervention? And I would say that that phenomenon is flattery. This is a text about conversion as preparation for immunization to flattery. Flattery, a problem within the socio-political space defined by the monarchies, the emergent forms of empire, dominated by the figure of the prince, who must be protected against flattery, where the intriguer and the corruption of his judgment might take place. And this is the end point of the text. So what starts as conversion becomes increasingly, towards the latter part of the lectures, especially in March, a discourse upon rhetoric, forms of speech, forms of memory, forms of writing, the necessity for writing as remembering, so that one can have to hand, ready to hand is Foucault's language, the skills with which to both care for oneself and make oneself capable of bearing the truth for others, for oneself, and for participating in a political order in which the fundamental principle is that inferiors do not bend superiors by flattering them. So, hence my earlier statement that I think one has to be skeptical and perhaps recognize Foucault's own complex, ambivalent, and shifting relationship to this domain of the techniques of the care of the self. This cannot be sentimentalized. It cannot be passed through the kind of realm of self-help, which, of course, in the 1980s also assumes a very particular vulgar form. 1981, we have Reagan, we have the horrors of the beginning of the AIDS epidemic, and of course we have Jane Fonda and the transformation of care of the self into a video program for what? For remasculinizing, among other things, homosexual bodies, male homosexual bodies. Okay, I think that's about 5 minutes, so I have 15 minutes left, yeah? I want to now sort of try and trace the moves that Foucault makes in order to see if I can convince you that that is what is at stake in this text. I'm trying, of course, desperately to retrieve from it a concept of the political that's more recognizable to me. This is shameless, and I can't help it. So, what is this care of the self, this epipenleo how-to, which I will never again try to pronounce, but sort of recognizable, yeah. It's not merely an assemblage of what Marcel Mons would call techniques of the body, although there are such techniques involved. And it will change radically over the period that he is covering, in its objectives, in the people to whom it is offered in pedagogical form, and so forth. So what we start with in the Platonic era, that is what is care of the self for the youth, by the elder, becomes something that is supposed to be practiced throughout the life, increasingly toward death. It is, he says, universalized, absolutized, and finalized in some senses. Or the self becomes the absolutized and finalized object of care of the self. But more than this, whatever it is, and it's changing over time, it is what Foucault calls an event in thought, which is to say a phenomenon in history that remains significant for contemporary thought, despite the surpassing of all the circumstances within which it first arose as an object of habitual but not yet normative practice. This event encompasses and is comprised of attitudes toward the self, forms of attention, actions exerted on the self, by the self, and so forth. Throughout the text, of course, Foucault is describing the techniques of care of the self or care of the self in terms of its capacity to generate that transformation of the subject that will be necessary. I quote for you from page 15e. The subject does not have access to the truth by right, but only, this is not yet a quote, but only, at least as the late Greek, Hellenistic, and Roman philosophers understood it, on the basis of a transformation of being. Quote, he must be changed, transformed, shifted, and become to some extent, and up to a certain point, other than himself. So this is simply what the meaning of conversion is in its pre-Christian modality, in its pagan modality, as he says sometimes. There can be no truth without a conversion or transformation of the subject. Of the two possible modalities of such transformation, there is eros, the movement of the subject toward a truth, or of the truth toward the subject, and work, travail in the French, which entails a transformation of the subject by himself. And work here is essentially the translation of ascesis. And travail, at least in French, has some of the insinuation of trial and test that is lost perhaps in the English term. He'll speak of the beatitude of the subject, and he will increasingly and commonly substitute the term transfiguration for conversion, which simply makes visible the kind of incapacity, the impossibility of escaping the tropology, the Christological rhetoric within which and against which he's constantly working. As I said, he does this through philological method and some wonderful and very close readings of words, not discourses, words. These become the hinge points through which discourse is accessed, but the reading practice itself is devoted to words. Among these is mastery, or mastership. And Foucault gives us a tripartite taxonomy of mastership, which emerges from his analysis of the relation within the Socratic dialogue, where the purpose is to liberate the young man from ignorance. Now, we have to note that this young man is in some ways always already liberated from the context, the consanguinal context of the natal household, is always already only a subject vis-a-vis the problematic of fraternity, is not imprisoned in genealogies and in the demands and within the strictures of heteronormative reproductivity. And of course, this has everything to do with the relationship between the object and Foucault's own project. I want to sort of leap forward a little bit to the argument that I want to suggest about why this discussion of conversion emerges, or what role it plays vis-a-vis the problem that is seen, namely flattery. I wouldn't have this thought if I hadn't been sitting in this fabulous seminar, actually, and learning from everybody in our readings together of these courses how to think differently about the way we have previously thought based on the books, and this especially around the question of psychiatric power. So my argument, as I said, is that hysteria is to psychiatric power what flattery is to not the care of the self, but the hermeneutics of the subject. That is to say, psychiatric power is only intelligible as the outcome of the development of certain state forms and discourses and so forth. So the homology is useful, but I'm not suggesting that there are sort of institutional homologies. This is a functional homology. Hysteria, you recall, was a problem for psychiatry because it confused somatic and psychic causes. Charcot's effort to force the body to speak its truth was a failed, for Freud at least, response to the fact that there is no objective difference between the hysteric's faked symptoms and the real ones. Her dissimulations have a reality effect. So on the body of the woman, which part Foucault neglected a little bit, So on the body of the woman, psychiatric power would endeavor to write the story of sexuality as perversion. Foucault, you'll recall, concluded his seminar of 1973-4 with a note from the archive in which one of Charcot's hysterical patients is undergoing convulsions. During this episode, she shouts out, "Camille, Camille, kiss me, give me your cock." Foucault describes this episode with a fair amount of flair. He described this episode, which he termed bacchanal, and which in his own speech must have become redolent with a homoerotic potency and suffused with a wry interest. But he also read it as the hysterics, you recall this, victory cry and counter-maneuver by which the hysterics responded to the ascription of trauma. That was on Psychiatric Power 322. Now, I'm going to leap forward a tiny bit and I'll come back to that moment. The training that the young man of the Socratic dialogue receives and whose reconfiguration Foucault describes will finally be described under the term perisque. Foucault glosses it as matrices of action or equipment. English loses the wonderful play, as I said, between maîtrise and matrice, which enables Foucault to make his argument. Indeed, this is related to what Foucault describes as the real development of a culture of the self. By culture, he means a, quote, hierarchical organization of values that is accessible to everyone, but which at the same time gives rise to a mechanism of selection and exclusion. This organization, he goes on to say, requires regular and costly conduct, which produced through forms of something that I have misquoted, which is produced through forms of practice. This is a practical knowledge, one that gives the subject ready to hand what he will need to function ethically. It's obviously not possible to chart the full range of metamorphoses that are described by Foucault in these loquacious lectures, but we can sketch them briefly as follows. In the first development and emerging from Platonism, the care of the self is transformed from the teacher's erotically invested concern with the student into a lifelong practice, which includes a kind of disinterestedness analogous to the doctor's relation to the patient. This is the first step in what Foucault calls the de-eroticization of pedagogy. I think this is important to remember. It's a counterintuitive dimension of the process he is tracing. Care of the self moves from perceiving the divine element in oneself, necessary for the assumption of a role in government, where care of the self is a compensation for inadequate education, but also a need to distinguish between those capable of government and the masses, to a generalized value which nonetheless only a few could access. Related to the latter, the mediation of the universal aspiration and the limitation of access is said to have been performed by fraternal organizations, schools, and sects. That's on 113. Foucault describes several forms of mental exercise advocated by philosophers who were increasingly, he says, deprofessionalized and folded into the role of advice and opinion. That's 143. These include morning self-examinations, letter writings, and so forth, and confessions that are not performed for God vis-a-vis an absolute truth. Foucault's insistent and recurring theme is the care of the self and knowledge of the self as well as knowledge of the world as co-implicated and entangled. The question of veridiction, of truth-telling, gives way to parrhesia in the later lectures, and as it does so, it becomes more and more clear what is at stake in Foucault's reformulation of Lacan's notion of vrai dire, but also why he could not indulge the oppositional politics of speaking truth to power that dominated the scene in the U.S. He wants a concept of avowal that is not merely submission to the discourse of power, not that which is asked of the mad person in the psychiatric institution. Not merely a submission to the discourse of power, not merely a confession before God, but a relation to others in which I myself can hold true discourse, and not by virtue of self-renunciation. To this end, Foucault arrives at a description of learning in which there is more than the receipt of the word with capital W. And in the French text, la parole is translated as either the word or speech, depending on whether it's capitalized or not. The point of this distinction is to mark the difference between passive receiving and active listening, and thereby to open the path to ethics. There follows a discourse on the ear, on listening, especially in Plutarch, wherein Foucault discovers something like an automatism. This is extremely, I think, important in the concept of Sperescre, and it has much to do with the distance between Bourdieu that Foucault attempted to produce. It's extremely important in that concept of equipment, but also in the notion of matrices of action, which Bourdieu also used. In Epictetus's writings, the recognition that logos is inseparable from lexis leads to a complex argument about the necessity for a technique with which to supplement the vulnerable because passive faculty of listening. The techniques of self that are used to generate this technique include silences, attentiveness, and various kinds of posture. They also, as I said, entail a de-eroticization. So, the important thing is that the subject become a subject of truth. He must speak freely, but frankly, with directness and candor, and above all, he must not flatter. Flattery is a risk because it allows an inferior to gain the superior's favors and benevolence, and by using his discourse. Foucault says he prevents the superior from taking care of himself properly. And then, in a remarkable passage, I'm coming to the end, in a flourish that's completely unprecedented in this text, he writes, he's ventriloquizing Lucilius, the figure of the flatterer and the dangers of flattery rush in here, in this insufficiency that ensures that we are never alone with ourselves, in this inability to be alone when we are either disgusted with or too attached to ourselves, in this non-solitude, in this inability to establish that full, adequate, and sufficient relationship to ourselves. The other intervenes, who, as it were, meets the lack and substitutes, or rather makes up for this inadequacy through a discourse, and precisely through a discourse that is not the discourse of truth, through which we can establish, fasten, and close up on itself the sovereignty we exercise over ourselves. The flatterer will introduce a false discourse, one that precisely depends on the other, on him, one that precisely depends on the other, the flatterer. And this discourse will be a lying discourse. Foucault recognizes that this is not the same flattery as that offered by the old sage, who is seeking the amorous attentions of the young boy. Not at all. This is socio-political flattery. That's Foucault's term. This is socio-political flattery, not based in sexual desire, but in, quote, one's position of inferiority in relation to the other. In the imperial court, he says it was a problem because the question of truth for the prince outstripped that of freedom of opinion. So, this is why I say that flattery is the reviled object of the preventive technology of the self in the discourse of care of the self, which culminates a long historical process, functions, as does hysteria, for psychiatric power, but this would require a slight reinflection. We would be talking about flattery is to the socio-political system of the prince what hysteria is to psychiatric power. I'm not going to say anymore. I'm going to leave it there in this kind of whatever. I'm going to throw that gambit down to see if there are any takers, and if not, then not. I will say one brief thing about Parrhesia, and that, this is where I started, of course, is the transformed discursive style of these lectures the result of coming to the position that Parrhesia is the only instrument, the only source of immunizing the political realm of the prince against flattery? Does that require of him, or did that require of him in his own mind, a change of style? I think it does. I think John Reichman has written very beautifully on this. I think this is part of how we are to understand this moment in which a strange restraint, which we might read as melancholia, which we might read in the idiom of Edward Said's late style, comes to play, not as a performative, I would restrict that term for a much narrower linguistic sense, but as the enactment of a political analysis that he gives the name ethics to. Okay, so there's mine. One more.
Okay, very rapidly, let me just try and open up the conversation with a set of questions. I think we've just heard three brilliant, different, possibly in some respects, readings of the text that press hard on key questions relating Foucault's genealogy of the desiring subject to his political project. Some more political than others, and maybe we'll talk about this a little bit. And of course, I'd categorize them as, death and meditations and self-styling of death, meditations on the Western subject, and then meditations on conversion and flattery. Okay, so Rosi Braidotti has emphasized, of course, the constitution of self as a test of the self, and to a certain extent, I think, in a certain, this will be a question, depoliticized way in relationship to the other readings that we heard tonight. Lydia Liu has drawn, I think, a crucial distinction between Foucault's method and Anglo-American speech act theory, between this inquiry in this text into the positioned subject and the questions of performativity of our speech. Now, Foucault sometimes himself fell back on familiar discourse and used the term speech act himself to describe parts of what he was doing. He did so in Mal faire dire vrai a couple of times. He says, Mal faire dire vrai, I will begin by proposing a brief analysis of what may be understood by a vowel, an analysis of the, quote, speech act. But whenever he does that, I think that he's doing that in the same way in which when he was referring to Althusser's notion of a state apparatus, he was bringing us into a familiar way of thinking in order to demarcate his own project. And so the really important piece of Lydia's intervention is to emphasize the demarcation that matters more and that we need to understand. And of course, Lydia also raises a pressing question about this Western subject that I'll come back to. And Rosalind Morris has challenged us to deeply interrogate some of the different techniques of the self, conversion especially, but flattery, but also in her text, her great text on the blog, mastery, the matrices of actions and writing and reading. And she's challenged us to interrogate them from a political perspective and to explore and to place them within their historical context, particularly 1981, 1982. And this is important for the notion of conversion and conversion away from revolution in 1982. So this raises three questions for us, I think, starting with the last cluster, and also with how Rosalind started to frame the intervention. It's how do we relate analytically to the study of these technologies of the self? In other words, what is the relationship between, one, unearthing and excavating and exposing these techniques of the self, to two, evaluating them or valorizing or devalorizing them, or three, using them or figuring out how to deploy them in our own political projects. Okay? And so this picks up on the question of the relationship between the descriptive and the normative, which I think is really important here. Second, who is this desiring subject whose genealogy we are tracing? Why these particular traditions of the care of the self? And are these the right ones? And do we see ourselves as Western subjects or in these histories? Do we see ourselves in these histories? Or even further, is there a Western subject? And then the third question is, what is the political work that this genealogy of the desiring subject is doing? Now, I'm going to quickly just launch a little bit on each one of these three questions, but paying particular attention to these passages on page 209 that were brought to our attention, pages 209 and then pages 252. So I'll come back to those quickly. But I want to have those in our mind. So on the first question, really this distinction between what are we doing excavating these techniques of the self, and then at what point are there certain valences that are placed on them? And I often hear in the discussion certain kinds of valences that are placed on these different techniques. And I really want to resist that. In part, I was trying to resist that last time by bringing in Donald Trump, which, who would want to think about Donald Trump? But in the context of truth-telling, right? I really wanted to challenge the idea that truth-telling is something that should be necessarily valorized, or that has a particular value. I hear it sometimes. For instance, the relationship of flattery to hysteria, and the homologies of flattery to hysteria does something, I think, to flattery that gives it a particular valence. That I take it historically over time, we would need to say flattery plays different roles in different techniques of the self at different historical points, of which one wouldn't ever want to say that flattery is a bad thing, or that truth-telling is a good thing. So, for instance, when you say flattery means you can't tell the real friend, parenthesis, the truth-teller, right? The technician of Parrhesia. Did he call the real friend the truth-teller? If he did, we really need to correct that, right? It's possible that at times a true friend is a truth-teller, but I'm not sure if that's always the case. In any event, what somehow we need to try and do, I take it, is treat these techniques and cares of the self in a more de-romanticized way, I think, which is important, I think, for instance, when we get to conversion. And I think that the passage on conversion, which is on pages 208 and 209, are really important here, because they become fascinating and revealing, I take it, of his own contempt, right, for his contemporaries right here, who are only converting to renunciation of revolution, right? The great converts today are those who are no longer believe in the revolution. Of course, I take it he's responding in part to the critics of his work on Iran, and he's also intervening on the socialist government that's in place and the new left, right? And the new left, and so, but I take it that conversion then becomes this thing that may or may not have positive valence, but that needs to be examined without inflecting it necessarily one way or the other. Okay, so that's something that I think that's important. Could you also raised the interesting question of, could the techniques of the self have this neoliberal character, right? And so in the article, the question is, in relationship to his relationship to neoliberalism, the question is, might these techniques of the self be described as techniques of leadership, insofar as leadership is the discourse through which we learn to hate democracy, to avow and even to love inequality, and insofar as these intrinsic characteristics of the neoliberal order, the question of Foucault's possible complicity with neoliberalism cannot be entirely ignored. So I take it here that I think there's no doubt that there are going to be techniques of the self that are associated with and produce and shape and help facilitate the neoliberal subject. But it's not care of the self that does that. It's the particular ways in which care of the self gets deployed, right? So the care of the self is also, in some sense, inflecting the hippie, is also inflecting the Bernie Sanders, is also, right? I mean, so it's not care of the self that is, or whatever. Take whatever.
He could use some more.
He could use some more. Yeah, well, yeah, I don't know. I mean, the point is that it's not a turn to, say, care of the self that is somehow facilitating or related to neoliberalism, but it's that we need to disarticulate all of the different techniques and then explore how they line up and lead in these different directions, I think. That's the first question. The second question has to do with the Western subject. I think this is fascinating. Now, I take it that Foucault, in 1982, is trying to excavate a history or genealogy of the desiring subject to show how Foucault, somehow has been shaped through these cycles of different practices of the self. We can interpret his work, Foucault's work, almost like a confession, in the sense of St. Augustine's Confessions or Rousseau's Confessions, as having a deeply auto-referential nature closely related to his own Jesuit upbringing. Okay? Now, the point is, of course, that Foucault is sharing with us forms of caring for the self that shaped him and a certain class of French intelligentsia at the time, possibly. And I think that what that means is that we could ask ourselves whether the work that he does, the choices that he makes, are themselves a care of the self. Okay? In other words, perhaps, and of course this fits neatly with the idea of reading and writing. In other words, he's tracing a story, but it could be that the story he traces is itself techniques of the self that he's exercising on himself. Now, I'm fine with that when I read the text as method, not necessarily as substance. In other words, when I read the text as giving me some insight into the kinds of techniques of the self that one might engage in reading techniques of the self. So I'm fine with that. I'm not a Christian. It doesn't bother me that his research project is shaped by his Jesuit upbringing when I read it as method, or rather when I see into it kind of an act of self-care itself. But it does call on me, I take it, to do the intellectual work that would be required to trace the influences that I might see elsewhere in terms of influencing subjectivity, desiring subjects, and that might, of course, involve a completely different trajectory. So the critique of this as perhaps a critique of the auto-Westernism here, which would be perhaps opposed to the Orientalism critique, could actually turn into a way of thinking about this as itself his own care of himself, which of course it was, and we know because every day he went to the archive, and it was an ascetic, it was an ascetic experience, the writing for him. I mean, when you talk to Daniel Defer, you get a strong sense that writing for him was an ascetic experience, was his ascesis, and going to the library every day was also, and perhaps reading these particular texts, which are different texts than maybe I would read. Okay, the third question then has to do with, so what then is the political stakes of this line of research? Now, and I think, Rosie, I was having a harder time hearing them in this preparation for death and the styling of our death. So I would want you to maybe address that. I completely agree with Judith Butler's comments last session in response to the first round of questions that we need to think of these these care of the self processes in a deeply reflexive way that does not make it easy to reappropriate them in a direct manner, right? And I'm wondering, and I'm beginning to wonder whether there's any proper manner to reappropriate these techniques of the self. On page 251, there's this fascinating discussion that then leads to what was the epigraph for Lydia's presentation and article. On page 251, right, he's talking about the 19th century, which could be reread as different attempts, that's in the middle of the page, different attempts to reconstitute an ethics and an aesthetics of the self. Schopenhauer, Nietzsche, dandyism, anarchy, anarchist thought, all right, series of attempts to reconstitute a self. And he asks, is it possible to constitute or reconstitute an aesthetics of the self? Now, he then passes from the 19th century to the present, on the bottom of that page, and he says, and he's looking, again, it's on the conversion question, right? He's looking at getting back to oneself, freeing oneself, being authentic, etc. One thinks of all the self-help manuals that flood the book market today. And he says, I do not think that we have anything to be proud of in our current efforts to reconstitute an ethic of the self, right? So there's a certain, vapidness to the 20th century forms of self, or a critique that it's not succeeding in some way. And then on page 252, at the top of it, he says, nevertheless, it's indispensable, right? It's indispensable. But of course, he doesn't give us. He doesn't seem to be helping us. As indispensable as it may be, he's not helping us here. Although it is so essential, and we see how essential it is in the rest of that paragraph. In his relation, where he's bringing us back to relations of power, back to the 1972 work, saying that it's indispensable for you to think about relations of power. You have to understand, right, the relationship of self to self. Now, Daniel Weich at the University of Chicago has written a really excellent essay on the civil rights movement and the Montgomery bus boycott, and trying to find moments of conversion there into the movement. Through overcoming of fear, through developing a different relationship of self to self. It's in an essay, The Politics of Self-Overcoming, Spiritual Exercise and Political Liberation. But again, he's excavating a historical, and it's really interesting, it's a historical movement of conversion in the relationship of self to self. But though that doesn't give us, again, doesn't give us much purchase, I think, on how, and maybe the question just can't be asked, how to do it. Deploying these histories in a direct manner makes little sense because of their deeply reflexive nature. They can't simply be turned around, inverted, deployed, instrumentalized, right? It's much more complex than that. But then that raises real questions for us, I think, as to other than a historical political connection, how these practices of the self can help us today. Okay, so those are three large questions, sorry, but hopefully to structure some of the discussion.
Wonderful, wonderful. Thank you very much. Since we are a little bit short in time, why don't we take other comments and then we introduce more problems in the mix. How far? Jean.
Yeah, we're going to go from the sublime to the now. I hope you're ready for it. I'm the now part. I think one tries to get away from it. The Christianity, it plays such a central role in all of this. And we're trying to get away from it, trying to get out of this, out from under it, out from being in it, and to get at what we call it worldliness. which I certainly like the worldliness part, but I think it's still very determinative. I'm kind of curious. This is going to sound really annoying, but what revolution is it that's being betrayed yet again through conversion or whatever? What is this? What is the idea, or not the idea, the reality?
Can you speak up because
Oh,
I
sorry.
hear it.
I said, just the last part was just picking up on what Ross said.
Quoted.
What?
What I quoted. This is
Right.
not mine.
What is it? What revolution? I don't know if he didn't say the word betrayed, but it's being betrayed that somehow should not have been betrayed. I'm just curious about to raise the obvious, most banal political question here. So that's all. I don't think that one can avoid the political evaluative dimension, much as one tries to. That was a really fancy, really elegant way to sort of avoid that, I have to say, Bernard. But I don't think one can avoid it, or that one should, the evaluative. And I don't think Foucault does, even though sometimes there's the posture of doing that. But I'll leave it at that.
So just very quickly, thank you, three of you. This was just totally wonderful. I think there's something super frustrating in these lectures, in part because it's there's an unevenness between this kind of privileged elite site of the cultivation of the self that I kept thinking of Albert Hirschman's From the Passions to the Interests. The entire book, in a sense, is about statecraft and the art of governance. Those of us who, I think someone somewhere said, he's moved from looking at the art of governance to the art of, cultivation of self. Actually, I think the book is partly about the art of governance and of those who govern. And I thought your intervention Raz, was absolutely right on the conversion. Where I didn't go with you was on the flattery. Because I think you actually could expand that out. It's not only flattery that is the danger. It is, as Hirschman shows, showing contempt at the wrong time, too much of an intensity in the wrong way, showing disdain in the wrong way, ever showing disgust. There's a whole sort of set of parameters of a kind of moral grammar that's actually not very moral, of the ways in which one has to modulate. So flattery is only one of them. But I think that as Bernard said, I think there's something really uneven, that there's a way in which it's very clear that this space between conversion and confession, it's not as if he's going, one's good and one's bad. He's actually setting out for us the modalities in which we can understand history. Right, that move between them, that they're blurred over and over and again, and that they're worked through, they're contested. It's not that we should do X. I loved your asking what is descriptive here and what is normative, because with Foucault we're always looking. So what's the political here? He leaves us very, very high and dry, and very intentionally so, it seems to me, on what the political stakes are of this, even though he says it's actually critical. On that page you pointed to, the question of politics and the question of ethics. He says that self to self constitutes a chain, a thread. This is not one of his discontinuity things where governance was over here and politics was back there and now we depoliticize. There's something happening there that he's leaving open for that potentiality of us to do something different with. And I don't think that's romantic in it. And I agree totally with Lydia that this is not a Western. So we could rewrite the entire history of Europe through Islam, through so many other venues of names that have been Romanized, that are actually from all over the Middle East. And I think your point is well taken. Okay, that was it.
Luca?
Yeah, so just in response to that kind of question about the revolution issue, I think it's pretty clear to me there that he's just remarking on a really banal kind of moment in the French late 70s, 1980s, particularly when former Marxists who had openly espoused the revolution turned on it. So he's thinking of Benny Levy. Benny Levy. He's thinking of both of the
new philosophe.
He's thinking of the nouveau philosophe. I mean, some of these guys he'd actually, at one point, kind of supported in some sort of way, but he seems here to be pretty tired of it. I don't think it makes sense to say that he's talking about the Mitterrand government because the Tournant de la Rigueur is later. That's in 1983. On the other hand, I think there are ways in which there's an interplay between the political and the intellectual here in terms of the flattery issue that's very interesting. Because already, I mean, I think the political context is less Reagan and Thatcher than really Mitterrand, who's come to power. And there's the question of, so in May 1981, he gives an interview with Libération, and he says, they ask, can you work with the government? And he says, you can work with the government, but without debasing ourselves, essentially. So there's this kind of problem that he's expressing in a directly political way here about how the intellectuals relate to the government, what that kind of relation consists of. And it seems like there's some sort of kind of play of mirrors going on here when he discusses the issue of flattery, but I wouldn't push that too hard.
Okay. So I also have a couple of questions, but perhaps you want to introduce some...
I think I have to answer
okay,
the
please go
political. I
ahead.
will not be able to sleep for the rest of my life. So, the fact that you can postulate a becoming subject on the horizon of death as something that nullifies the future and actualizes the present, I think is simply of the greatest importance in providing what I would call the contingent foundations, to quote Judy, of a political subjectivity. It is so obvious that I didn't even sort of say it. And there is no subject other than the processes of constitution of a time-bound practice of the self, which is always contextual, always relational. When Deleuze reads it, and there may be an overdose of Deleuze in my reading, surely, but I think Deleuze does injustice, it becomes radical immanence, the empirical transcendental, the subject that is absolutely grounded, accountable, and yet movable, historicized. I do not read Foucault in a social constructivist methodology. It's quite obvious. So I do not believe that the political is the management of engagement with only potestas. And I said it quite clearly. The legal scaffoldings is half of the story. In fact, I think as Foucault goes on, you get the potential part of it becoming the site of the political defined as the management of actualization is a Foucault term, it becomes central in the Foucauldian reading of Deleuze, the actualization of alternatives, of possible other ways of becoming subjects. He gives us a very clear toolbox to do that, and I think it's often overlooked, because here then we have questions which I find really frustrating. The complicity of Foucault with neoliberalism. Badiou's reading of Deleuze is an apologist of neoliberalism. It's just because they haven't read the actual metaphysics of the subject that is at work here. Profound, carefully, rigorously regulated. But implicit as it is that actually you're not endorsing that which you're analyzing. You are actually opening up possibilities for other ways of becoming subject, which is up to us. It's hard labor, but it gives us the tools, and it provides a counter reading both of the historical process, the genealogy of the subject, and the conceptual roots of the constitution of the subject. Foucault is a major conceptual thinker. He's not a sociology of subjectivity. And reading him in the way Butler does, it's fantastic, but no, it's very reductive. There's a lot more going on here. There is a real rematerialization of the subject taken away from the dialectics. There is a quarrel with Marxism. Historical materialism and hysterical materialism are what he's shooting out at. He's trying to go somewhere else. Of course, he dies young, we do not know. I think he would have gone towards radical immanence and monism. He would have gone out of Hegel, and way out, although he invokes him almost desperately at the end of this text. So having made that clear that there is here an alternative, a real longing for and a grounding of an alternative subjectivity, I would think that the question of death is absolutely crucial today. If you don't want to be applied in your approach to politics. Here is a thinker of thanatopolitics that gives us not only a metaphysics of death based on Blanchot and other things, but a set of apparati by which we can talk about the necropolitical, Membe and all that, but queer necropolitics, the crucial importance of ways of dying as a system of management in the world today, the militarization of death on a global scale. He gives us a way of operationalizing that and going beyond. Look at demographics and longevity. The whole industry of living forever, not alienated. The denial of death is one of the features of advanced capitalism. I lead a group of people who refuse to dye their hair. It's a political battle, trust me. Assisted death and assisted suicides. The whole legislation, the whole question on this, about which you know more than I. So if you want to go even with the partisan side of this, if you start from death, you get a whole set of other premises. But the punchline for me is there is here a toolbox by which the political consists in reinventing subjectivity, doing something else with it, beyond, beneath, and before the mechanisms of capture, of potestas, of the trappings of the subject. I think that's the punchline. That's why I insisted on this part of it. Hit back, go on.
I'm going to use that as an opportunity because I certainly recognize in the last moments here of your response forms of relation of the problem of dying and the management of death that were in The Birth of Biopolitics and that were in those lectures. So partly, for me at least, I mean the question is why this particular formulation after we've passed through those other analytic projects? Is it a departure? Is it a moment that is going to become something else? Is it a stopping? We just, as you say, we don't know this. But I just want to respond very briefly to, I wish Jean was here because I'm going to answer her question. But first of all, the status of flattery as a problem of simulation within the politics of derediction understood sociopolitically is how Foucault puts it. I'm sure that at this point in time we might, or even if we were doing a history of that era and had the means to do so, which I certainly don't, one might say there were a multiplicity of other questions in the air. But he hangs a lot on that. He invests that problematic with the task of signifying the risks to the political in a system, the Greek monarchical and Roman imperial moment, when the question of the prince, which the post-democratic question arises. So I think if we are speaking very specifically, not about techniques or the care of the self in general, we're speaking about it as it was, and he is speaking about it as it was transforming itself within that arc of, say, 300-400 years or what have you, such that by the end it can give way to its own Christianization. It can both enable and be transformed by its Christianization when renunciation of the self and so forth become crucial issues. But so what links, I think the question actually lets me think something, what links the problem of revolution to the problem of conversion? And it has to do with the previous course, which is on confession. That is, what is the relationship between avowal and revolutionary politics? This is not, is it a matter, his own, he was accused previously of having done precisely the same thing vis-a-vis the Communist Party and so forth, right? But that is the issue for him. He says the problem at this moment is not people have stopped being revolutionary, but they avow not their commitment to that principle, but to the party. And the party has come to be precisely that to which one owes one's avowal, rather than a political project. But the conversion part, I think, just is a way of addressing the general problematic in the air at the moment. I mean, what does revolution require? It requires the changing of persons. If you're not within the tradition of ideology critique and you're not thinking of ideological counterproduction as one of the means by which you change the subject, then you've got to think of it in other ways. And of course he comes strictly from within that Jesuitical rhetoric to think the task of changing people. This is not which revolution, but how to change people, because that's what you have to do for revolution. It's an anti-spontaneist argument. And despite the fact, and that's interesting, that he writes so much about this practicing of self that makes available an apparently spontaneous response to what? To changing contingent conditions. Yeah. So this is a very different argument than how to engineer the revolution. This is against the not against the question. It's not the revolution. It's party politics that is the object of the avowal that needs to be changed. And he says very specifically, that's the problem. We make our avowals to the party, not to the project and to the transformation of ourselves, which is what we need to do. As for leadership, I will continue with the idea that neoliberalism is our moment of anti-democratic politics, in which we no longer have the straightforward figure of the prince/sovereign. We have something else, but so it's not going to be flattery. Nonetheless, I think leadership is that for which we have to. That's the way in which we, or that's the thing that should organize our counter discourse.
Just a few words. Foucault calls his this work analytics. Okay. So it's not that he's endorsing any of these techniques. Analytics, and he is centrally concerned with the positive relationship between self and truth, right? And knowledge of truth, and he works his way through this different techniques, through pagan techniques, through Christian, and the political. Where is the political in all this? I think that's the question for him. I mean, it's not automatic that we know what the political is. Is it in the government? Is it in the prince? I mean, in different periods, he sees different transformations, metamorphoses. And if you say the political is now in our relationship to death, well, he might acknowledge that. Or this is changing, and he's showing that nothing is simply there. Everything is transforming into everything else, and so then it's extremely difficult for us also today, living in this world, to even identify what the political is, much less what we want to transform. You see? So the analytics here is extremely important. He's, offering a method. Perhaps it's not getting us anywhere, but this kind of rigor is very interesting, and to see he just takes something and gives you a thorough analysis. And I think it also raises the question about our assumptions about the political, as if we know where to start. We don't. I mean, neoliberalism, there is no high moral ground. He's not taking a high moral ground as to everybody else is wrong. And he's very patiently taking ideas apart and see, for instance, page 173, and he's on the bottom of that, speaking of the Neo-Platonic tradition, and he says, first, the privileged status of the know yourself as the form of care of the self par excellence. Second, the theme that know yourself leads to the political. Third, the theme that this know yourself also leads to a catharsis. There are all these possibilities, not one thing or the other. Finally, a fourth thing is that a number of problems arise between the political and the cathartic. The relationship between the cathartic and the political creates a certain problem in the Neo-Platonist tradition. He's not valorizing any of this. He's simply taking us through his analytics, right? And doing the very hard work of thinking otherwise. This is really not easy. I think people debate today about politics as if we know where it is. I mean, that's precisely the question he's opening up. So just wanted to say this.
I don't think that's fair, though. The people are. I think that's exactly the question that's been on the table for the last few years, in some sense, for many, many people, is that we don't assume that we know what the political is anymore. I mean, I think that's what Rancière's work shows us. I think that's what Foucault shows us.
Yeah.
But you're kind of saying, well, we're taking it for granted. I'm not sure people are taking it.
There's discussion about what valorize or what we don't valorize. I mean, of course, that's what's so interesting about this book, and he was already asking this question.
Yeah,
right?
I guess my question about that is that first, I mean, I think I agree with you, but it throws you into incredible cognitive dissonance if you read the earliest lectures as we've had, when you get to this kind of terminal point where I think starting in 78, he starts to say, all right, now I'm just going to kind of describe the positivities, and he's back almost to like the archaeology of knowledge when you kind of there wasn't an obvious kind of political Foucault, but I think for the readers it creates a lot of trouble. And now, on the other hand, I don't necessarily completely buy that he's just indulging in a kind of neutral kind of description of positivities. And so the question is kind of...
Right, so we do valorize.
Right,
No,
I mean...
this is not about he's taking a neutral position. No. He's working very hard to identify the place of action. Okay, so let me put it at the place of action. Things have changed so much, we can't just adopt the original, whatever we used to do
And
in the revolution.
potentialities.
Right.
Positionalities, and so be, encouraging us to be imaginative,
But
innovative, the kind of future that Rosie was talking about, opening up.
Right. But
right?
why is Greece the other scene on which you kind of
Right, and why do you
make
talk
that
about
experiment?
that
Why
for
Greece?
what?
Why Greece?
Just when
Sorry.
one after
Oh,
the
you
other,
mean
please.
today? Sorry.
It was my fault. Go ahead.
Yeah, so the question was, why is Greece the other scene on which you're going to search for alternative forms of this kind of ethic and ethical,
No, he's not-
political
I don't think he's
transformation?
searching for an
I mean,
alternative.
I'm not necessarily searching, but why that genealogy?
Because it absolutely upsets the standard vision of the Enlightenment humanism
Yeah.
that has put the teleological process of an undeterred and unchangeable reason as the motor of world history, all the way to Hegelian Marxism. That's why. And is bringing in a totally different alternative as an example, as a model of the crucial political question, which is how do we constitute ourselves as other subjects of desire, echoing, but he should have footnoted, the social movements of the day, feminism, LGBT, the gay movement, and which he was an activist, but he doesn't footnote, so he doesn't even, because he's not doing applied stuff, he's really thinking about how this works, and unless we see the rigor of this, he does become a relativist, he dabbles in this and dabbles in that. So the question is, what vision of capital is he resting this reading on? What vision of liberalism is he resting this on? And it seems to me that we have to read him as a process ontologist, that he sees capitalism as precisely what will become in 1000 Plateau, the multiple reterritorialization, deterritorialization codes, the waves of change that come over and reappropriate immediately. Feminist revolution, pornography, gay rights, whatever, immediate recuperation, the speeds of reterritorialization, and the margins shrinking. Do we know that, working in the university? The shrinking of the margins of possible alternatives. So he gives us, I think, the making of an alternative structure of subjectivity to give us the hope that actually we can make a difference by becoming different subjects of desire, detoxing from our attachment to structures that are fundamentally vital but bad for us. So to act cares of the self, ethics of the self, is the hard labor of disengaging from that which actually keeps us going. As operators of cognitive capitalism in the university, we must recognize that. The constant labor. But that constant excavation of it. I think that's process ontology, then otherwise it becomes a relativist. It bits
But
of
this
it
is
and bits of that.
exactly the moment where Deleuze takes distance from Foucault. This is, exactly, you are attributing to Foucault perhaps what Deleuze would have liked, but what he what he specifically didn't see in this moment of writing. So, I think we can't come on. The Greece is a certain kind of signifier for democracy within precisely a Eurocentric self-understanding, which Foucault will undo from the inside. One can't pretend that the kind of aesthetico-erotic interest is not there. And what's interesting is that, as a problematic to start with, the mastery is internal to the operations of democracy. But it's not in a way that the concept of mastery is completely incommensurable with the one that was defining both structural Marxism and psychoanalysis. And so from that recognition, I think there comes a demand then to work through this these very knotted relations, and the fact that they are actually not, they are not consistent with the narrative that a certain kind of, facile self-narration of Western political forms had been comfortable with for a while. But I don't think I don't think we could ever ask the question of why did he do this. But I think one can see what problematics he was forced to confront, having done so. To me, a lot of the surprise of this text was the insistence on the figure of the master throughout, and it's never disavowed, actually.
Yeah, I'm coming more and more to the hypothesis that actually it's not a question of unearthing alternatives, but it's a question of returning to one's own education. And I think that what he's retracing here is his own education, and he had done it before, so it's not as if. So I don't think that the biographical, erotic elements, etc., are necessarily that prominent. He had made that move to go back to Aristotle in 70, 71, etc. But the move to go back to Plato in the way these start, and then the move through all of these texts that lead into the Jesuit tradition, I think, is something about him actually. Now, I read this completely differently now as a result of this seminar, or of this last reading, as this is his care of the self, in the sense of he's tracing his own subjectivity as a desiring subject, right? When he says you have to trace make a genealogy of the desiring subject, it's not the desiring subject as in some general thing, nor the Western desiring subject. I think this is all about care of the self as care of the self. It's kind of squared in the sense that it's of his own himself as a desiring subject. He has to go through that. This was his education, right? This is what he did at the lycée. These are the texts he would have been exposed to, and these were the texts that would have formed him from all of his Jesuit professors, right?
Why do you want to hive off the erotic question? To purge it? No, I don't. That is to say, there's a practice of the self that precedes its becoming the overt object of the textual project. I think that is.
Well, it's just
that is to say, it's also internal to the Jesuitical education. It seems to me a false.
I don't want to hive off the erotics at all because that's so important to the desiring subject. But I do want to resist a reading where 1980 all of a sudden he's kind of exploring new areas or something. Which it's you can have all of that erotics of the desiring subject, but reach there from just this work as care of self. In other words.
So Bernard, do you think it's basically Foucauldian phenomenology of right? People have argued that Hegel, right, is recounting his own biography through the phenomenology of right. So would you read Foucault as basically giving a wink at the end because he says, this is the phenomenology. That's like one of the last lines.
Yeah. Well, that would be even a richer or more explicit link than I had. I'm converting to a new reading of this text.
Okay.
Right.
Is that a public event?
Are you not afraid he
No.
uses it as sort of in fact, a confession, but what you're saying is it's a self-confession.
Yeah.
It's a diary.
Yeah.
It's a spiritual diary.
Yeah.
Interesting. But then does it? Yeah.
I'm not sure that by saying that he's analyzing his Jesuit upbringing, he is doing some sort of Jesuit exercise. I think he's doing something entirely different. That's exactly what I'm saying.
He's not saying he's doing a Jesuit.
I know.
Right, okay,
I know.
yes.
Bernard and I have been talking about that for
Forever.
many months now, so I exactly know what I mean and know what he means. But one of the things that he's doing is to trying to understand what are the main and the underpinning concepts of that Jesuitic upbringing in order to put them in a different genealogical relationship with, for instance, changing one thing that struck me as extremely important in this conversation, and in particular in Rosalind's intervention, is the focus on conversion and the fact that although there is a very important and interesting critique of metanoia, which is the central concept of Christian conversion and of Jesuitic examination of conscience, he doesn't mention Paul one single time. He doesn't even mention the whole problem of translating in Christian terms metanoia, so repentance basically after Jerome, etc. But he is trying to put them in a completely different perspective that allows him to somehow override this other Jesuitic discourse. So and that's where something extremely interesting happens that links to one of the questions Lydia raised about Benveniste, which we've also mentioned Benveniste a couple of times here, because of indeed what he is looking for, Benveniste, from his philological historical method is what is the name of the institutions that underpin all those political procedures of taking care of the South, questions of conversion, etc., etc., etc. What is the name of those institutions, and how do you historicize them? And that's extremely interesting. I totally vouch for. I totally advocate also for introducing Émile Benveniste on this Foucauldian discussion. But anyway, I'm so sorry. You were going to go ahead.
I think we have to end, but
yes.
But that would explain in part why there isn't kind of this explicit instruction element to it, right? Because he's actually doing it, right? In other words, it's like, okay, you want the answer to the question is actually to do this yourself. Right? So we're going to have spring break. All right, so we got a little spring break.
Yes.
And then we come back for 12-13, and then 13-13.
Yes.
Yeah. Bon.
All right. Thank you.
Thank you.